I hate to put words into Alireza Firouzja's mouth, but let's be honest, we were all thinking it. He's up next. Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John. This is the channel where we try to make complex chess simple and easy to understand. And today we have a game from Alireza Firouzja. Now, Alireza is currently the second highest rated player in the world. He is the only player other than Magnus Carlsen to be rated over 2,800 as of the recording of this video. And more importantly, he plays compelling, interesting chess. Lots of tactics, a lot of attacking play, the kind of red meat that chess fans like to chomp down on and really enjoy and are really entertained by. By the way, put in the comments section if you think Alireza is going to be the next challenger to Magnus Carlsen. Today's game is a game he played against Baadur Jobava, and let's jump right in and take a look. Alireza has the white pieces. He plays e4, c6, d4, d5. This is a Caro-Kann. He chooses to play the advanced variation, gain space in the middle of the board. Jobava plays bishop to f5, getting that bishop outside of the pawn chain before playing e6 to solidify that center. And Alireza plays knight to f3. This is really the absolute main line these days of the Caro-Kann. It's sometimes called the short system, although I've heard of other lines called the short system. But this is a sort of a slower developing kind of system for white. White wants to get space, control black's pawn breaks, and kind of squeeze black. In this game, he does that, but then things really break open a little bit later. Jobava plays e6. The bishop's outside the pawn chain. By the way, this is similar to the advanced French, except black has the bishop outside of the pawn chain. However, he wants to play c5, and that will take him at least 2 moves, whereas in the French, it only takes 1. That's the trade-off. Bishop e2, developing. Knight to e7. Another main idea for black is to just go ahead and play c5 right now and challenge that center immediately. Jobava chooses a little bit slower of a plan, a little more maneuvering of a plan. Castles, h6, gives that bishop a place to sort of tuck back on h7, so the f5 square could become available for the knight later. Knight b to d2, knight to d7. It's often common that instead of, that in this point, white plays c3, but you'll notice that Alireza delays that move. He wants to reserve the possibility of perhaps playing the pawn directly to c4 and just skipping c3 altogether. So he doesn't play the c-pawn up. By the way, this is a very, very complex position. We're going to do the best we can here. Even former world champion Vladimir Kramnik has recently said he doesn't really fully understand this position. So that tells you how complicated this position is. Knight to b3 gets the knight out of the way of the bishop on c1 and helps put some pressure on the c5 square, making it a little bit harder for black to break free on that square. The bishop tucks back to h7, a4. So we know the key idea here for white is to gain space and to limit black's counterplay. So Alireza begins to gain queenside space with a4. a6, bishop to d2. Placing the bishop on d2 helps Alireza control the dark squares on the queen side. Queen to c7 gets the queen off the back rank and then helps support a future c5 push. Rook to c1. Now notice Alireza is placing his rook opposite his opponent's queen. There might be some tactics there later, so black has to be careful. It's always a good principle to put your rook opposite the opponent's queen. He also is supporting a potential push of that pawn to c4 to open up the c-file. Rook to d8. Bishop to a5. He could have played c4 right here and probably been in pretty good shape. Bishop to a5, putting pressure on the queen and rook. b6 has to be played. Now bishop to b4. That bishop at b4 is taking aim at that d6 square, which is vulnerable and weak. And he knows black will end up having to trade off dark squared bishops, which will leave his dark squares weak. a5 kicks the bishop, then bishop to d6. The queen has to move, of course, it's under threat. Queen to d2, knight to c8. That forces the exchange of the bishop. bishop takes f8, knight takes f8. Okay, so the dark squared bishops have come off. Now, in this position, with less space, an exchange of pieces is generally good for black. So, in some ways, this is an achievement for black. The problem is, it leaves him with weak dark squares in his position. So, there's a trade-off. Some fewer pieces to get in each other's way, but the dark squares are weak. Knight to e1. The knight wants to play to d3, where it can control c5, maybe even go to f4 and cause trouble. Knight to e7, the knight gets back into the game. Knight to d3, knight to d7. Notice black has not castled yet. It's very hard for black to find a place for his king in this line with knight f3 and bishop e2. Knight to f4. Now, this is a really strong move, and it creates a big problem for black. Black's two liberating moves are c5, or playing the pawn at f7 to f6, but he cannot play the pawn to f6 as long as that knight is on f4, because if he does, the e6 pawn will be hanging. So that knight at f4 really restricts black's counterplay, and also it can maybe jump to h5 in a direct attack itself. So strong move. He goes ahead and castles Jobava. Now he could have played c5 here. It might have even been the best decision. After pawn takes, bishop to b5. The a5 pawn actually is not a big deal. He takes with the knight, queen to c7. He attacks the knight at a5 and the pawn at e5. If he takes with the queen, then c4, knight d4, and the pawn at b2 is hanging, and the pawn at e5 is hanging. So he probably wouldn't want to take that. After a move like bishop to b5, which is a computer recommendation, it's equal play there. Castles, rook f to e1. That e5 pawn is sort of the key to controlling that space for white. So Alireza indirectly defends that pawn with the rook. Of course, the bishop's in the way right now, but it won't be forever. Also, the rook can maybe play in a rook lift later. Rook to c8, continuing with slow play, not playing any of the key pawn breaks. c3. So he goes ahead and plays c3, even though he delayed this move. Perhaps there would have been an opportunity to play c4. He probably could have played it earlier. But what I think Alireza is thinking with this move is, I'm going to attack black's king. He's castled kingside. I have all sorts of space. I want to attack, but I have this knight offside on b3. So I just want to solidify my center and get as many pieces over, aiming at black's king as I possibly can get. Rook to c7, g4. Alireza begins his attack. The pawn at g4, of course, you're gaining space and an attack on the king, but you're also controlling the f5 square, so the knight can't hop in to that square. So Alireza has controlled the center and now is beginning to gain space on the king side. Queen to b8. This is the beginning of a maneuver to try to get the queen back to help to defend black's king. Queen to e3. Strong square for the queen. Helps defend e5. Limit c5 push from black. It can move over to g3 or h3 and also put some pressure on h6. Very powerful square for the queen. Queen comes back to d8, hoping to defend a little bit on those dark squares in that d8, h4 diagonal. h3 defends the pawn on g4. King to h8. Now, this might be a little slow in this position, but I can't really find any better ideas. It really looks like white's gotten what he wants. A bind on the position, and now he can slowly move all of his pieces into an attacking formation, and black is really going to have a hard time defending against Alireza's attack. Knight to d2, the beginning of the shift of those pieces over to the king side. The knight can go to f1, f3, and go f1, g3, a lot of different places. c5, finally the push, bishop to b5. Now, this does a couple of things. It allows the knight at f4 to go back to e2 and then push with f4, if white chooses. Also, the pressure white is putting on the d7 knight means that black has to stay in contact with that knight at all times, or he would lose the piece. Knight c6, king to h2, getting ready to move the rooks over to the king side to attack, so getting the king off of the back rank so those rooks can move over. Pawn takes, knight to b4. Rook c7, queen c7. So this is an achievement for black now. A pair of minor pieces, a pair of rooks are off the board. Now there's a c-file. Now the most aggressive move for Alireza here is definitely queen to g3, but that does allow black in on the queen side, so you're sort of burning your bridges for a killer attack. He plays a little more strategically circumspect move. He plays queen to c3, challenging that open c-file. Now, if Jobava takes the queen, then pawn takes queen, knight c2, rook to d1. Now, the knight is currently defended by the bishop at h7, but after knight b8, that knight was under attack. Knight b1, the knight at c2 has a hard time finding a place to go, and white looks to be better in this position simply because the black pieces are tied down. You look at the knight at b8, it can't go anywhere right now. So white would be better in this position if black takes the queen on c3. So instead, Jobava plays rook to c8, rook to c1, and now bishop to c2. An interference move, cutting the coordination between the rook and the queen. But now, the queen can move to g3, the most aggressive position on the board, supporting that g5 pawn advance. Queen to d8 to help control the g5 square, and now bishop takes knight. That possibility just sort of hovered over the position. Now I can take the knight and discoordinate black's pieces. The queen is drawn away from the g5 square, and white can play the pawn to g5. So queen takes bishop, g5, breaking through. Jobava plays hg5. With some computer analysis, it looks like the best move here is bishop to g6. Rook c8, queen c8, knight takes g6, hg6, fg6, gh6, queen g6. This looks pretty forced. And it looks like white's just totally winning, but apparently after queen to f8, defending h6 and attacking f2, black may have enough to hold this position, the computers say. And I think the main reason is because of the weaknesses of these pawns at a4, b2, d4, and f2. Those are all weak. And also there are possibilities of the queen penetrating and maybe getting a perpetual check. So that was probably the best chance for Jobava to defend this position. He goes ahead and takes on g5. Queen takes g5. And of course, he wants to trade queens with Alireza. He doesn't want that queen to stay in an attacking position. So he plays queen to d8. And of course, Alireza says, no, the queens are definitely not coming off. Queen to h5, check. King to g8, knight to f3. With threats of knight to g5, threatening queen to h7 check, or even queen to f7 check. g6, defends those squares, attacks the queen, but rook to g1. Now the rook is in the attack, and the pawn on g6 is pinned. So every single piece is in the attack. You notice these strong players, they make sure that all of their pieces are involved in the attack. And Alireza has done that here. All four of his pieces are attacking. Knight to c6, trying to get a defender back as quickly as he can. Queen to h6, queen to f8, offering another trade. Queen h4, I don't think so. Queen to g7, and now knight to h5. The knight cannot be taken because of the pin along the g-file. And then the knight aims at the f6 square that it can land on with check. Queen to h6, the computers like queen to h8, but something like this, bishop f5. But, you know, defending with this level of accuracy is pretty much impossible. Maybe Carlsen can do it. That would be about it, and probably not him. Queen to h6, rook to g4, a really strong move. It defends the queen, but also sets up all kinds of threats of moving the rook to the h-file later on. King to f8. Now, just as an example of what Alireza's move rook to g4 is threatening, let's say black goes ahead and just grabs this pawn on a4, right? Low-hanging fruit, take a pawn. Then this would happen. Knight f6 check, king to g7, which he has to play to defend the queen. Queen h6, king h6, rook to h4 check. The king is forced back to g7 because the g5 square is controlled by the knight at f3. King to g7, rook h7 check, king f8, rook h8 check, and then king moves and rook takes rook when the rook and the game is over. That was a threat set up by rook to g4. So Jobava, seeing this, plays king to f8. So now knight f6 would not be a check. Queen to f6, planting that queen into black's position. And here, if he takes with the queen, then just rook to h4, threatening mate on h8 if he moves the queen, so the queen would be lost, and there's not nearly enough compensation for the material. Here, the computers give +5 for white. The threats to f7 and the dark squares would just be unstoppable. If he instead takes with the pawn, of course, then you just lose the queen. So he plays knight to d8, help to defend f7, rook to h4, setting up those threats down the h-file. The knight, still cannot be taken because the queen would hang. King goes back to g8. What he wants to do is help control the h8, maybe move the queen back to g7 and hopefully consolidate. Another piece into the fire. Look at that constellation of attacking pieces. Man, boy, I wish I could play like that. Really, really impressive. And there's a very nasty threat with this knight to g5 move. Let's say, for example, again, black just takes the pawn at a4. Then watch this. Queen takes knight. Check. Queen sack. Rook takes queen. Knight to f6 check. King goes to g7. Rook takes queen. King takes queen. And the stinger at the end of the scorpion's tail, knight to f7 check, would win the rook, and he would be up an entire piece in the endgame. So Jobava doesn't take. He plays bishop to d1, but guess what? The same tactic still works. There's nothing he can do. Queen takes knight, rook d8, knight f6, king g7, rook takes h6, king takes h6, knight to f7, check. And in this position, Jobava resigned, and Alireza had another win on his way to a 2,800 plus rating. Is he the next challenger to Magnus Carlsen? Say so if you think so in the comments below. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.